there. Thanks for that, Pranit. We asked for people to do their kind of networking in there. A lot of people have suggestions for future topics because these are just coffee catch-ups, so they're fairly short, etc. So we'd like to gather ideas, and I'm certain James will want some of those questions at the end. So please do that. Look, as I say, this webinar will be recorded, so please just click on that, and we'll share it in our social media. Okay, on to 2023, just to give you a little idea of what's kind of gone on in that space. Well, interestingly enough, we had reflections on feedback literacy and iterative change from Professor David Carlos, who's here today as well. There you go. So you can't keep some good people away. In May, we had student identity and assessment and grading from Yuzo. Again, really engaging presenter there. So again, if you missed that one, I recommend you go back to the recordings. I didn't attend the July meeting of HERDSA, one of the few times that I've missed it, but I know Pranit was there running the special interest group in Brisbane, and we met face to face. So again, if we get time, I'm certain Pranit will give you a little bit of feedback of what we decided in that particular one. We then move on to August, and here we are, improving feedback literacy. Seems to be a bit of a theme this year through sustainable feedback and engagement practices. We have Dr. James Wood here. The next one for your diary is probably the 22nd of September, online assessment framework. So again, that'll be brought to us by the Australian Business Deans Council group that's actually come to Western Sydney University. And I think they've won an award on this. I think it was an AAUT award, I might be wrong, on this particular kind of work.
And it's actually in October, Simon, sorry.
Oh, there you go. We got it wrong again. Well, it said on the thing September. Never mind. Okay, that's cool. And then at the end of the year, and Pranit doesn't even know this, I have been working on one which I knew would be an interest to the group, and it's about maintaining assessment quality in the age of AI. Couldn't really get away in this year without doing something on AI. So we will end the year on that particular one. Speaker to be decided, I think. Okay, next slide, improving feedback literacy and sustainable feedback engagement practices. So as I said, David Carlos kicked us off in the year. What can I remember about David's talk? It was about those assessment feedback graveyards. I remember the photograph of all those bits of work stuffed into various pigeonholes. He talked to us about the importance of scaffolding feedback early on in teaching and learning. And of course, feedback at the end is a bit of a waste, okay? So I think everyone recognizes that. More generally, I think feedback literacy in higher education is all about getting students to recognize the value of the feedback. I think that's where we start with. I think they need to understand that feedback is an essential part of the learning process that can help them improve their work. That's not always made particularly clear. But then they need help in interpreting that feedback. I think that's a real challenge for us. That's that feedback kind of literacy part. They need to be able to understand the feedback that they receive. It needs to be done in a timely fashion. They need to clearly identify areas of improvement. And of course, they need to be able to make changes to their work before the next assessment. There's no point in having assessment, feedback, etc. if there's no kind of follow-up for them. I think that probably takes us on to kind of skills. They need skills in participating, particularly in self and peer feedback, because we have to rely a lot on our students to do some of that feedback work. And I think that has to be built into the teaching that we undertake. So it's important that students are able to provide feedback to their peers, and again, receiving feedback but providing feedback is just as importantly. It needs to be constructively done to improve their own work. But also that kind of self-regulation bit of feedback. Students need to be able to manage their emotional reactions to feedback. It was a bit of the thing that I always used to focus on myself. They used to be able to look at it and motivate themselves to improve, and not, which is quite often the reaction, a kind of negative reaction to poor grades and contesting the feedback that they get. And I think that has to be done in a variety of ways, but very much sustainable and engaging kind of practices. I think David Bow talks very much about sustainable assessment and sustainable assessment literacy in this bit, which takes us nicely on to our speaker of the day, Dr. James Wood. Welcome. Said, yeah, welcome already. Lecturer in education at the School of Educational Sciences, Bangor University, a place I've been to many, many times. In North Wales, not New South Wales, just pointing that one out. So he's in the proper Wales. He's the Director of Assessment and Postgraduate Courses, Executive Committee member of the Annual Assessment in Higher Education Conference, which I had to think about. And I haven't been there for quite some time. The last time I think I was there, James, was in Manchester in 2019. I was getting away from there. And actually, that's one of the few times I met Phil Dawson there. I remember him was speaking there. So you have to go all the way to Manchester to meet the Australians. Very interesting conference. Look, James's research focuses on designing and developing assessment and feedback environments and the practices that empower students to seek, generate, and use feedback effectively. And then the really interesting thing, he's also very interested in how technologies can support dialogic and collaborative feedback practices to enhance learners' agency and well-being. So I think this is a nice scalable one. So I'm going to hand over to you, James. We're all eager to hear what you have to say about feedback literacy.
Okay, so my interest in this subject. Can everyone hear me, by the way?
Oh, I'm hoping they can.
Yes,
So my
we can.
interest in this, great. My interest in this topic goes back to 2012 when I was teaching on a pre-sessional at UCL. Gave a student feedback that they really had to change their essay before they handed it in. That student then made cursory changes to spelling and grammar, handed the essay in, got a very low mark, failed the course, and literally had to go back to her country. And I found that very shocking. And I got very interested in how we can use assessment to help students learn more effectively. And that led to, as work was being done by Naomi Winstone and David Carless, they were the two biggest names in my doctoral thesis, which I did at UCL Institute of Education. I also moved to South Korea and I did a lot of work with students, basically from 2015 until just now, where I was collecting data and trying lots of different things with them to try to get them to become agentic in the feedback process. And that kind of brings us to where we are now. So I've just started a job at Bangor University. I was offered the position of Director of Assessment and also postgraduate courses. So I've been a little bit busy over the last year in terms of being able to produce new research, but I'm working on it. So a lot of this is based on my first article in assessment and evaluation, where I kind of pick out the gap that I think still more work needs to be done on how technology can enhance student uptake, engagement, and feedback literacy. And I'm also going to talk about some of the other work I've been doing in different journals. So this is going to be a bit of a mixture of different perspectives from different papers that I've been working on. So to give some context, I think we are starting to see some changes in thinking around feedback in the UK at least. So in the UK, we have a national student survey, which is the main way that we judge how things are going in universities. And these are the criteria that were about feedback pre-2023. And you can see most of it is pretty much what teachers do in the feedback process, which wasn't really aligned with theory. And then we've had some useful contributions from Naomi Winstone and David Bowd and David Carless, which have started to look at the impact that these kinds of assessment regimes or quality assurance regimes and policy documents have on the feedback process. And Naomi Winstone identified that these documents shape practice. And if we want to shift towards learning-focused feedback cultures, then we have to think about how the student's role and responsibilities are positioned within those papers. And I'm not sure if it was connected. I wanted to ask Naomi about this when I saw her at Assessment in Higher Education conference. But now in 2023, question 14 has in fact changed. So we're now asking students, how often does feedback help you to improve your work? Which is really, really good. And it's a new way of looking at quality in feedback. But I wonder how many students will be able to say that feedback has often helped them to improve their work. And that's something that I'm very concerned about. because of course, Dylan William talks about feedback being more work for the recipient than the donor. But I've come from South Korea, and I've come into a British university system. And as director of assessment, I'm looking at different things that are going on in the university and in the department. And I wonder, how often is it the case in today's higher education course environments that the students are doing more work around feedback than the lecturers? That's a kind of rhetorical question, but I'd love to know your experiences of this as well. So again, Naomi Winstone and David Carless talked about the influence of accountability and quality assurance on feedback processes. And the problem is that feedback does double duty. So it supports, it's supposed to support student learning, but it also satisfies the demands of accountability. And the argument basically is that the quality assurance requirements may be conflicting with new understandings of how important it is that the students are central in the feedback process and that they're agentic in the feedback process. And so feedback is doing double duty through these requirements to manage these competing audiences for the feedback comments. And so the conclusion is that quality enhancement of feedback processes could profitably focus less on teacher inputs and more on evidence of student responses to feedback. And that's something that I wholeheartedly agree with. And I'm wondering, what is the participants' experience of quality assurance? So in a moment, I'll tell you what mine has been, but what is your experience of quality assurance? If you have exam boards, if you have external examiners, when they look at the feedback that's going on in your course, what are they focusing on? Are they focusing on what the teachers are doing? And a certain amount of that is necessary, but or are they also looking at the results of that feedback process on student learning? So I'd love to know your experiences there. So feel free to write something in the chat, or if you've got something to say, use the mic. I'll give you a second there to think about that. So as you're coming up with some ideas, I've recently been sitting in on all of the exam boards. And so we've had external examiners coming in, they're very experienced, they're very knowledgeable, and their comments are very good. They talk about the quality of the assessment criteria, whether the assessment criteria are being referenced in the feedback. They talk about the standards, whether or not the standards are high enough. They talk about whether the feedback is feeding forward to future assessments. And yeah, most of what they say, I absolutely agree with. But in the cases I've seen, they haven't been looking at evidence of student uptake. They've been looking at what the teachers are doing, but not necessarily what the students are doing with the feedback. And so, if quality assurance is the test that we are teaching to, or that as teachers, we are kind of the students in this test, and if that is the test that we are studying for, then there may be some washback. Washback in assessment is the idea that the test can influence what is learned or what is done. And here, I think quality assurance is, to some extent, affecting what is done. Okay, so nobody has anything to add there. Maybe quality assurance is different in Australia. But what I think we're saying here, and this might be calls to Newcastle for David Carless, who's in the audience, is that the quality assurance that I've been looking at is focusing on quality of feedback, which is great, but it is looking at feedback and information. It's focusing on delivery. The students are receiving the comments, but we're not really looking at what the students are doing with the comments. And David Carless and Naomi Winstone call this the old paradigm of feedback. And I can see that although theory has changed over the last 10 years or even longer, practice still is yet to catch up. Whereas what we really want is a shift from providing information to stimulating uptake, recipients, student agency in the feedback uptake process. So feedback is sense making, focus on student uptake, students generating their own feedback, social constructivist perspective of feedback. So we could view it from the perspective that good feedback is only that which is engaged with and used. And one caveat there is that not all feedback has to be actually used by students as long as it's engaged with. Sometimes our feedback might be wrong, or sometimes we may have misunderstood what the student was trying to do. So as long as students are engaging with the feedback, they don't have to actually use it. And I think that's something that's quite important to mention. Okay, we have Simon Bedford's comment in the chat. Scale often means feedback is generic and not good quality, a handout or model answers. Individual feedback's hard. Some of the best is audio or video feedback, which helps them interpret the feedback. Yeah, I'm glad you said that. I'm going to be talking about that as we move on. So we've also got this backdrop of neoliberalism, of decreasing budgets. In the UK, we've had massive inflation. Students are still paying the same fees as they did before that massive inflation hit. And in actual fact, it's getting quite hard for us to actually finance education. It costs $9,000 for an undergraduate to go to university for 1 year, but it costs us a little bit more than that to actually teach them. So you can understand the kind of strain that we're under. As Simon said, the scale is the problem, that it's very difficult to give individual homework feedback. And we're hearing this on Twitter as well. 20 minutes for 5,000 words, or in my case, for 20 credits, for a 20 credit module, I get 40 minutes per student for feedback, which isn't very much because there might be multiple assignments as well. So it's very difficult to, if there's 2 assignments, it's very difficult to give formative feedback, summative feedback, and then formative feedback and summative feedback again for a large group. So what can we do about this? And of course, students do want dialogues to clarify how to understand feedback and how to use feedback, even if it's summative. But they are also questioning, they're very aware of the unfair conditions, they're aware of the strikes that have been going on in the UK, and they're worried about asking for a tutorial, which is their right, but they're worried about contributing to these unfair working conditions. And we can't give tutorials to every student, as good as it would be. And Hill and West 2021 have got a very good study where they give dialogic feedback to every single student. But one of the things they point out is that it's very time consuming and it's not going to work for most of us. But of course, if feedback is going to be effective, it has to be used to alter the gap between current and ideal performance, or we need to be able to close the feedback loop. But is this happening? Again, this is a question for the audience. I think this is in Western Ontario, Mensick and King, and they looked at students using their online feedback, and they actually found that 38% of files were never accessed by the students. But if they could see their mark without opening the files, then 42% of the files were not accessed. Price, Handley, and Miller in 2011, I think, gave a kind of 50% claim. And then Evans in 2013 gave a 50% claim. And Winstone and colleagues also found that in a qualitative study that students tend to just log in, check the grade, and log out. So even if the feedback is there, often the system is quite clunky and you have to click on multiple buttons to get to the feedback. So they often don't bother. So feedback needs to be convenient. It needs to be really easy to get to because they're not using it. So what happened when I got to Bangor? Well, I started poking around, and on some courses the feedback view rate is quite high. It doesn't necessarily mean that feedback is being used, but on other courses it's quite low. And this was an assessment course, not the one that I'd taught, but from assignment 1, which is supposed to be formative for assignment 2, we can see here that fewer than 50% of the students actually viewed the feedback. And then even if they view it, how many are actually engaging with it and using it for assignment 2? So at least in my context, and I'm not sure about your context, this is a really big problem, right? Even getting students to view feedback is a big problem. So getting them to actually use it in productive and effective ways is a really big issue. So this is kind of the central issue that we're dealing with. Why don't students view or engage with or use feedback? And what can we do about it? So going back historically, Black and William looked at the difference between formative and summative feedback. And they reviewed 681 articles, and they found that work that focused or assessment that focused on formative approaches, studies that focused on formative approaches with goals for improving work stated clearly, so feed forward, if you don't mind the term, and a second opportunity to submit, and viewed as an interaction or a dialogue, were much more effective than summative grades and comments. So we've known this for quite a long time. And you know, Black and William are very famous in school education and to some extent in higher education as well. So as director of assessment, coming into a situation where perhaps not an awful lot has changed, we probably need to do things in small increments, right? So what can we do to adapt what's happening now to encourage engagement and uptake? And one view is, which is coming out of Surrey University and Naomi Winstone and colleagues, is the idea that we need to become designers of feedback. So we need to change the way our courses work. You know, in a way, feedback literacy is the idea that if we change students, then hopefully they'll do something different. But I think now with teacher feedback literacy, we're thinking that, okay, maybe we need to change the design of our courses so that we're embedding those opportunities for students to use feedback. So feedback has a place to land. So we want to shift self-assessment, peer feedback and teacher feedback to be formative, and that can provide a landing space for the feedback that's generated. And of course, teacher feedback literacy means supporting learner agency in seeking, understanding and using feedback, and then designing module courses and programs with this in mind. And this is what I want to try to work towards at Bangor. So baby steps. You know, when we talk to teachers about their practice, it's a sensitive business. We don't want to tell people that they haven't been doing a very good job. And actually, they have been doing a really good job, but the conditions that allow students to use feedback in the most effective ways haven't really been there, perhaps because you know, directive assessment is a new role that only just has started to exist. And that might be the case in other places as well. So, you know, if we have to just give summative feedback, then maybe we can see summative assessment as formative. And that's something that Michael Sankey said on Twitter and gave this diagram, which I quite liked. So if we design summative feedback, ideally, we plan into courses a place for that feedback to land. So every summative assessment has a designated place where students will be able to use that feedback. And that is woven into the fabric of the courses. And one of the ways that's being suggested for doing this is programmatic assessment. So we might reduce the number of assessments. We might not just have one module, one assessment, but assessments that go across modules. So students are encouraged to bring ideas from different modules and use them together in a synoptic and cumulative way. And another option is interactive cover sheets. This is something that David Carlis has written about in his 2020 article in Active Learning in Higher Education. And Harris et al. 2022 have done an article on this in assessment and higher education. I also attended their online training for lecturers at Leeds. And this is basically the interactive cover sheet that they're using. So the student thinks about what actions for improvement did they receive on the last assignment before they start writing the assignment. And they think about and then after they've done that, they think about how they try to improve their report for this assignment. And the student asks if there's anything they would like the lecturer to focus on in the feedback. And then the marker comments on what the student has said and the essay itself. And perhaps there's a kind of ipsative component as well, where they can talk about how well the student has achieved their goals and also answer their questions. So I think this is a very good method, and I'm trying to implement this at Bangor. We've already tried it on our teacher education programs, and I'd also like to see it used across postgraduate courses in the next semester. So why should we do it? Well, dialogue, of course, is thought to be key to the effective socio-constructivist feedback process, where the student agency is key. I think that's probably the wrong reference there, but anyway. And that also helps learners develop their feedback literacy when there is a dialogue, when there is some kind of discussion and students are thinking about where they are and where they need to be. And David Carlos has got a really good metaphor about this, where he talks about getting advice from your in-laws about raising your children. And the idea that, you know, maybe you're asking them about how to, they're telling you how you should be trying to get your children to behave better or something like that. And, you know, you're not particularly happy to be getting this kind of feedback from your in-laws. But then if you actually ask them for advice, you know, being as they've raised a couple of children already themselves and they're knowledgeable and they're experienced, you're much more likely to take it on board. And in a study I've done, I also found that when students are able to ask questions, they, especially many questions, you know, not just one question, but you know, ask for feedback in the first instance, and then maybe clarify that feedback or challenge that feedback in the second instance, then they start to position themselves as much more agentic within the feedback process. And I'll talk about that more a little bit later. And I do suggest that engagement or response to previous feedback should be incorporated into the assessment criteria for subsequent assignments. So it's difficult for me to tell everybody in the department, we all need to start doing formative feedback. That is quite a challenging thing, I think, to ask people to do. But to ask people to change their assessment criteria to reflect the student interactive cover sheet and how they report using their feedback, and to allocate a small amount of the grade to that, I think that's quite reasonable. And that's a change that I think we can start to make. So what about interactive cover sheets for formative feedback? Because in an ideal world, we're giving formative feedback. So are interactive cover sheets good for that? Well, I've actually done a study that kind of looks at this kind of interactive dialogic feedback. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But before I talk about that, so what other methods can potentially improve student uptake of feedback? And Simon might be interested in this one, as he's already kind of shown his colors there. And it's screencast feedback. So I've been experimenting with screencast feedback over the past 8 years. And I've been reading and keeping up with the literature. And a lot of the literature isn't very positive about it, but a lot's changed. The reasons for that is often technical issues, but a lot of those technical issues have now been solved because of internet speeds and online hosted screencast feedback hosts that also offer some dialogue. So I'll talk about that as we go along. So the benefits of screencast feedback in the literature are that it's more workload sustainable, effective. It results in improved quality and detail. The vocal features increase the clarity and understanding. And of course, you can use body language as well. And you can reduce miscommunications because you can say more and leave less for the student to try to figure out for themselves. Cavalieri, who I know, Michelle Cavalieri, who I know signed up for this session. I'm not sure if she's in here right now or not, but she actually found that changes after screencast feedback were more successful than after written feedback, which is a very useful finding. And of course, screencast feedback can be more relational as well. So Karen Gravitt's done some really good work on the importance of relationality in higher education. But screencast feedback can be seen as conversational, human, and supportive, and it conveys social presence. I think importantly, you know, when there's a lot wrong with a piece of work, we tend to focus on just the things that they need to fix. and we forget to tell them what they're doing well and what they should keep doing. But in a screencast, I found that you can say about 6 times as many words as you can in the same amount of time in written feedback. So you've got more time to discuss the positive things that the students are doing, as well as the negatives, as well as comments that support your relationship with the student. And I think that's a very, very good thing. But a lot of the screencasts in the literature, in the research in the literature, are deployed within this old paradigm of transmission. So it's focused on what the teacher is doing and not what the students are doing. And the learner is positioned as a passive recipient, and their agentic role in the uptake process is not really taken into consideration in these studies. And Pitts and Winstone, in a book article in 2020, said that this just replicates the process of paper comments. And this is one of the lowest goals for technology enhanced learning, just replacing what's happening and maybe making it a little bit better. But ideally, we're transforming what's happening within feedback. So ideally, we want to position screencast feedback for agency and uptake. And dialogue has a really important process in that. So how can we provide opportunities for dialogic meaning making without giving everyone an impersonal tutorial? As in Hill and West, they met every single student, they had a chat with them, grades improved, student satisfaction improved, but it's very, very difficult to do that sustainably. So I found in my research that students usually only have a few questions, and some students don't have any questions at all, especially if you're using screencast feedback, because screencast feedback increases their understanding of the feedback in the first place, but they do still have quite a few questions. And if you're using a Google Doc or Microsoft 365 or a screencasting client where they can ask a question about a particular timestamp, then that can allow them to be dialogic. And if that's not possible, then you could also have a group Q&A session after feedback's been given. And that's another good possibility. And I've been trying to figure out how to make this work because we're using Turnitin at Bangor. And Turnitin is not very dialogic. But if we produce a screencast using a tool like Loom, then actually, this is me doing a Loom, the student can then choose a timestamp and they can actually leave a comment, and then we can reply to the comment. So you can get the URL of the screencast that you've done. You can put that into the Turnitin comments, and then students can click on it and they can start having a dialogue with you. So it's not only Loom, I think you can do that with Teams as well. So if you record something on Teams, students can then start a dialogue about what's going on in the Teams call. And that is quite an effective and good way to do it. And of course, students, this was a comment from a student very recently, the most detailed and serious feedback I've ever received. And this is very common. In the last 8 years I've been doing this, this is a very common reaction. So I actually studied this in an article in Assessment and Evaluation in Higher Education and got some results. And before I asked, should we use interactive cover sheets for formative feedback? And my answer to that is not really. I think it works better to use a cloud document. So this is Google Docs, but you can also use Microsoft 365. So in an ideal world, we ask a forum question, and then they submit their URL of their Word document to the forum, and that allows you to have a discussion in the comments. So why this is better? Well, first of all, I think that this is a lot more informal. So, here the student is really thinking about what they want to do with their essay, and they want to calibrate their opinion here. Does this plan sound okay? So they're giving me a plan, and they're asking me to address that plan in the feedback, which, I haven't really seen this kind of detail in a cover sheet, which I think might feel a bit more formal to students. So this is an initial feedback request. It's like a cover sheet. Students are asking for what they want me to cover in a screencast, and then I address it as I address their other feedback. In this case, a student is talking about peer feedback and wants to calibrate their understanding of the peer feedback. and asking for my take. So they're actually highlighting a particular part of their essay where they've got some confusion, and they're asking me about it. So again, their ability to actually highlight a particular paragraph or particular sections and ask specific questions that the feedback is then going to address is really effective. And it's much more effective for me and much more gratifying for me to be answering their questions than just commenting on things when I don't know if they're even going to be receptive to those things that I'm saying. And this is more evidence, again, from the article. In this case, the student is tagging. I've already given them feedback, and they're tagging me in by putting my Gmail here and saying, I've got your feedback, and I'm thinking about changing it, but I'm afraid of this. So if I do this, would it be okay? So they're calibrating, and then they get a chance to use that feedback. So they get to calibrate their understanding and then see how it works, and then get the final feedback as well. So see how it worked out. So this was a very common thing that they would do. They get the feedback, they understood the feedback, but they're just not quite sure what to do with it. And that's one of the biggest reasons students don't use their feedback. And then I can often just say, yes, that does sound good. It doesn't take a long time. And students, really importantly, students actually clarify their understanding of feedback. And this is something Simon was saying at the beginning as well. When they don't understand the feedback, they can't use it. So they need to clarify it sometimes. Sometimes they want to question it. And sometimes they just don't disagree. They don't agree with it. And then sometimes when they explain their disagreement, I say, you're right. You know, sometimes I'm wrong. It's true. I'm sure we all are at times. So sometimes I agree with the student. Sometimes I say, okay, then you need to explain it a bit more. And sometimes the student gets to know why they weren't correct in the first place. So in this case, a student is arguing with the feedback. And through that discussion, they came to really understand what the problem was. So I argue here that cloud-based document dialogues offer an alternative to interactive cover sheets, especially if there's a chance to resubmit. And screencasting is optional. I know not everybody wants to do screencasting, but if you have some kind of dialogue with your formative feedback, or even your formative feedback could only be dialogue, you could just give students a chance to ask 5 questions or 3 questions, and then you only answer those 3 questions. And that makes formative feedback much, much more sustainable than going through the whole essay, right? So what do students think about screencasts? And this again comes from the paper that I just introduced. Well, they said that they felt like it was having an office hour. So I actually did have office hours for these students. No one attended. They just asked me questions through Google Docs about their video feedback. And many of them just felt like they'd already had their office hour, so they didn't have a question. They also felt that actually, you know, my screencast might have been 17 or 20 minutes, and they felt that this was so much effort. But, you know, written feedback might take me 40 minutes or an hour. But they actually feel that the screencast feedback is more effort than the written feedback, which is funny. This comes up again and again and again over the years. I'm actually probably doing a little bit less in terms of time, but they feel that I'm really caring about their work and spending my time on it, because they just don't believe that teachers give them a lot of time on their feedback, even if there's a lot of comments, which is quite interesting. And again, here, the student knows that you've seen every sentence in the work, and that makes them more trusting. So, you know, giving them screencast feedback really did mean a lot to them. And it can also influence their engagement as well. So this is the result of a teacher screencast feedback study in terms of, you know, the themes that came out. And basically it helped them to understand what the standards were. One of the reasons for that is that you can actually use the criteria when you're giving your feedback. So you can actually look at the criteria and you can say, you're not in this bracket, you're in this bracket because of this. So it makes it very, very clear. And that helps them to notice the gaps between their work and where they want their work to be. And it helps them to use their feedback. Because when you're giving them feedback to be more critical, you can show them an excerpt of a critical paper and then point out how it's different from their paper. Of course, it's time consuming, but it is very effective. And when the transmission of feedback fails, having some kind of dialogic opportunity, ideally some kinds of personal dialogue, but if not a group dialogue, lets them elicit more feedback, question that feedback, and challenge that feedback to better understand it. And that allows them to have an agentic orientation. The technology seems to decrease the power distance, but it can also increase it. So in the Winstone et al. Paper I showed you earlier, they had to click lots of places on Moodle to get to the feedback. In Google Docs, they've got Google Docs on their phone, they press a button, they can see their feedback almost instantly. They get a message to their email saying that somebody's given them a comment, and they can look at it so easily. And that does seem to make a difference. And so I think that there is a worthwhile trade-off between the time it might take to answer questions and the gains you get in learning from feedback. And I'm with David Carlos here again, where if we need to reduce the amount of summative assessment so we can make time for formative assessment where there is dialogue, I think that's going to be much more powerful. And what I'm going to try to do from now is to get in touch with the external examiners and to discuss this with them beforehand to try to get their agreement with it, so that we don't have any problems down the line. And also maybe they've got some good advice they can give in the process as well. So peer feedback can also be improved with video. I know some people are skeptical about how to set this up, but I've done it several times, and it is very effective, and it does, it has worked consistently for me. And I found that as I've done it more and more, I get more and more students willing to do it. But that's probably another seminar. And the reason why I think video feedback is good is because of general concerns with the quality and benefits of peer feedback. Winston and Carlos talked about the potential, but also the fact that there's still a lot of problems with it. Students are worried about critiquing each other's work, which leads some to think that it's better to be anonymous. I think it's better to be the opposite. The more relational peer feedback is, the better it is, in my experience. And peer feedback often focuses on very shallow concerns rather than substantive global concerns. And of course, because giving peer feedback is thought to be more beneficial than receiving it, some people think that we shouldn't really be bothering with the receiving part. It's just getting students to self-generate feedback is the most useful thing. But I would say that if peer feedback is dialogic and the dialogue is ongoing, then giving and receiving are equally beneficial from the data that I've been gathering. So this is data from my teaching in higher education study about the difference it made to their sense of community on the course. And this was actually an online course during COVID. So they said that it made the fact that they could see their peers giving them feedback on video made them feel there was a community where they weren't competing. Their peer mates were co-workers or teammates, not strangers or competitors. And in South Korea, the context of this study, there is a grading curve. So 30% can get A's, 30% B's, 30% C's. So students are loath to collaborate, but we were able to break through this in this study. So they also felt that they were making an emotional connection, feeling that they had friends in the class, and that really impacted their engagement. When they were all engaged together, there was a kind of positive bandwagon effect that pulled everybody up, which was quite dramatic. They felt that their peers were making a lot of effort on their work, and the facial expressions really helped them to mitigate the fear that they were being critical, because they could smile, they could use body language. They didn't feel so shy about giving critical feedback because they pretty much felt that their in-person persona would prove to the receiver that they really cared about them. And this is actually an excerpt of the transcript. The students are much better at screencast feedback than me because they're very relational in their comments. They say, I really liked it. I thought you write very convincing points. Great job on that. Thank you for a nice literature review. I can see you've worked really hard. I often don't have time for these kinds of comments, but most of the students had these kinds of comments at the beginning and end of their screencasts. And actually that's encouraged me to use this kind of approach as well. So the thematic results from the study were that the screencast feedback was higher quality and it was more global, which I think I've talked to David in the past about that being the holy grail of peer feedback. If you can get them to do global, substantive, high quality discussions, that's good peer feedback. So it helps providers and receivers to mitigate that social effect, that worry that they'll be construed as being critical and not helpful. The discussions, it was Dialogic again, this study, they used Google Docs to clarify their feedback. Those discussions supported their agency in actually seeking and using the feedback. And it helped them feel like a caring community. And a few students said that the screencast feedback from peers and the ongoing discussion they had was more helpful than the teacher feedback because it was ongoing, because it was multiple cycles of feedback loops that were being closed before they even managed to submit their summative feedback. It was social constructive, a new paradigm, and it felt effortful, caring, and it encouraged that uptake and reciprocation. And also they did 3 to 4 cycles. So they'd do a screencast and then they'd have 3 or 4 conversations about how to enact that feedback before they closed that loop finally. So it was really quite effective. And subsequently, I've used it again and I found very similar results to the first time. Well, I use it every time now, actually. So we might think from this that, okay, problem solved. If I provide this high quality formative feedback and these peer review opportunities, students will use it to improve their work, skills, and knowledge, right? It's going to happen. Well, yes, a lot of them will, but not all students will even use formative feedback, and they use their formative feedback to varying degrees. And why is this? Well, it kind of goes back to the Carless and Bowd paper on feedback literacy, students not appreciating feedback, students not understanding how feedback can be used to improve their work. In South Korea, for example, students have only ever received summative feedback. So they just don't understand that feedback can be used formatively. And that's one of their big takeaways in their feedback literacy at the end of an opportunity like this, that I never realized feedback could be used for helping me to learn. Because of their feedback culture, because of their previous experiences. And of course, because they haven't got very much experience of working with feedback, they tend to have mental blocks. And the students I was working with were very, very good students. It was Seoul National University, best university in Korea. So they tend to think their work is already very good. And they're very surprised when they find out that it's nowhere near where they'd like it to be. And that can sometimes cause breakdowns. So how to work with their emotions is very important. And of course, then they need to understand the standards and the gap between the standards and their work. So teacher feedback literacy, of course, we need to design our courses and our modules and our programs for uptake. We need to think about those relationships. We need to manage the practicalities, and technology is very, very, has lots of potential for helping in those ways. And then we can help students to develop their feedback literacy. But how do they develop feedback literacy? And I think this is a question that there are many answers to. There are many possibilities for how students can develop their feedback literacy. So this is an answer that I have. And I think there are many possible answers, but I think it's important to build a community. So having students chat about life and interests, discuss quality and standards and criteria with exemplars, to express their feelings about their previous feedback experiences, about, as they're getting feedback, having early casual feedback opportunities and getting them to discuss them, I found is very useful. Offering a proportion of grades for formative and reflective portfolio work, I think is a good method as well. Sorry, I stopped looking at the chat for a while, but I can see that there's been some discussion on the chat. But maybe we can go back to that a bit later. So discussing, and reflecting on previous experience of feedback and their own barriers to feedback. So I introduced a lot of these concepts to the students, like barriers to feedback uptake. And I asked students to think about what their personal barriers are and to think about how they can work through them. And perhaps ask them to do a short reflection in a kind of portfolio. I introduced concepts like dialogic feedback, zone of proximal development, agency, and I asked them to think about how feedback works. And of course, I asked them to make comparisons of first drafts and exemplars, but also share with their peers, because I think comparative feedback literacy is something that develops, and I think it's something that develops very nicely in groups where they can see how other students are doing things, and they can get some really good cues as to how they can do things that way as well. So these are some of the concepts that I introduced to them. I won't go into too much detail there. And I think emotions in the feedback process are a very important perspective. This was data from a student. And I was teaching the last class right at the time there was the horrible disaster in Itaewon. So that happened on Saturday night, and then I had my students in class on Tuesday. And it just didn't really feel like we'd be able to continue with the class before we had a chance to kind of just decompress our feelings about it. And I was quite surprised when I was asking students, how can we support your, I can't remember what the question was, but they said that talking about emotions from feedback was really helpful and actually stopped the student from giving up the class or not attending the class because of frustration. And they also said that talking about other things outside the class that were emotionally affecting them was really important for their engagement, not only in the class, but also with their feedback. So I was quite surprised. Intuitively, I felt that was the case, but I wasn't really looking for this in the data, but it did come out of the data. And I do something like give them a Jamboard, give them a few of these concepts which I've explained, and then get them to work in groups to try to kind of formulate their understanding of how these different things work in the feedback uptake process. And also I explain David Nichols' work and work on exemplars and how students learn from exemplars. And I kind of give them all of these concepts to kind of think about and work with. And then I asked them to do a kind of forum activity where they think about what they discussed in their peer groups and come up with their individual ideas of how learning happens from feedback. And then if there are misconceptions, I kind of explain something like this. I kind of show them the diagram of the zone of proximal development and where these different things can kind of expand their zones. And that's something I do at the beginning of courses to kind of try to help scaffold their feedback literacy. And so we start with these portfolio tasks, and then students might submit a first draft for peer feedback and ongoing dialogue, and they get a week to do that. But I found that it's quite good for them to compare with an exemplar before they start to give peer feedback, because especially in South Korea, students have never written essays, research-based essays before. So when they compare with an exemplar and talk about it, that actually provides scaffolding for their peer feedback, because they don't really have much to say in peer feedback at the beginning. But as they learn more and more about what effective research writing looks like, they have more to say. So it's cumulative. A lot of peer review studies are short term, but peer review abilities really improve over time. So then they submit to the teacher and they have a chance for dialogue. I give screencast feedback, and then they compare with a new exemplar. Now their work is better, and they generate their own feedback and apply it to their final draft. And I find that the peer feedback continues even after this. I don't say they have to do it again, but by now they've found out how useful it is, and they're just doing it naturally anyway. And also the comparisons continue as well. So the comparisons with their peers' work, the comparisons with exemplars, all of that just continues spontaneously at this point. And then they finally submit to the teacher, and then they get less feedback. It's mostly about how they've done according to the criteria and goals for next assignment. And then by the second essay, if there's 2 essays in a semester, I don't tell them that they have to do peer feedback, but most of them do it anyway. So by this point, they choose to do peer feedback, they choose to do comparisons. And so, if we take generating and receiving and producing and engaging with feedback as a mark of feedback literacy, then we've got solid evidence that this does improve their feedback literacy. So this is some themes from ongoing research, which, as I said, because I've been busy with my new roles, I haven't had time to properly go through yet. But students tell me that at the beginning of the course, and some of them actually drop out at this point, why are we talking about psychology? Why are we talking about feedback literacy and emotions and feedback? They've got no idea. But by the end, when I get data from the students, they say how really, really helpful it is to have a theory of how feedback works before they start getting empirical evidence. And then it's a combination of the theory and the empirical evidence that eventually convinces them to engage fully in the peer feedback process and the dialogic teacher feedback process. And they find that intellectual candor from teachers and peers and seeing others' feedback and their responses to it is really important. So I actually let peers see each other's teacher feedback, and then they can see each other's responses to the teacher feedback. And they find that that is very, very encouraging, because they can actually compare their own recipient strategies with peers' recipient strategies. And that becomes something that they actually learn from. And that's something I presented on in AHE this year. Receptivity to peer feedback and quality of peer feedback is evolving in cycles as well. That's something that seems to come out from the data as well. Socialization with peer and care from the teachers gives students a chance to discuss their problems and feelings, and that can sometimes unblock blockages. It can sometimes stop them from missing classes. It can sometimes get them back to work on their work. The discussion with the peers can be more useful than the teacher feedback because it's dialogic and ongoing. Peer feedback can help students identify things that were beyond their ability to notice. And then exemplars give them examples of how they can actually put that peer feedback into practice. Using the Google Docs particularly lowered barriers to students actually participating, because they were so used to using it. It was so convenient to use it. One button or 2 buttons, or click on the link in the email, and they could be right into their dialogic discussions. And then feedback uptake and literacy seem to emerge through these entanglements of relationality, use of technology, giving them time, giving them space, lowering power differences. And in South Korea, there's a lot of power differences. If you're older than another student or you're younger than another student, that makes a big difference to how they interact. But all of this can be minimized if we offer these very informal opportunities. And this is how one student put it. I asked them, they said something about this, and I asked them another question about it, and they came up with this diagram. What they meant is Google Docs as opposed to Google Classrooms, but they felt that normally there's this big inhibition when it comes to asking a question to the teacher. And it's still there with Google Docs, but Google Docs minimizes it a great deal. And hopefully we can get the same kinds of results from 365 or other technologies as well. So this basically is the model I came up with in 2021. I'm sure that some people could do better graphics than I can do. But the idea is that students need to understand the benefits of feedback, and they need to understand the standards in order to understand the gap between their own work and the standards, set goals and regulate those goals. And dialogic screencast feedback, teacher and peer, really increases their understanding of this landscape It helps them know where they're going. It helps them know where they are. It helps them to self-assess. The community and the technology of the screencast motivates them. It makes them feel like they have to reciprocate. It makes them feel they're in a relationship or a group who share a common goal. One quote is, all soldiers in the same war, came from a Chinese PhD student. And then comparisons with criteria and exemplars, that also helps them understand the assessment and feedback landscape. It also helps them self-assess, goal set, and regulate. All of this encourages an agentic orientation, which leads to feedback uptake and literacy. And as they go through cycles, the ability to set and regulate goals and the motivation to engage with and use feedback increases. And students say that at the end of courses that they're very interested in asking for peer feedback from classes where it's not a done thing, contacting their colleagues in the old class to see if they'll give feedback even in different classes where those students are not in those classes anymore, asking teachers for feedback if they don't give it, asking for exemplars, asking for criteria. So it really does seem to, well, they say at least that it makes a big difference. And I think a good study would be to go back to some of those students and find out how their behavior actually changed. So in conclusion, in an ideal world, we want to shift our focus of quality assurance and what good feedback is to student agency and what students do in the process. And I believe David has said this and probably said this in his seminar. What I want to do at Bangor is reduce the number of summative assessments and build informative opportunities, longitudinal assessments where there are a number of different things that are assessed, but these things build up and help them to do better on their work. And this is also one of the suggested remedies for working with ChatGPT. So where there's big inconsistency in that portfolio, that might be a case of assessment security being more problematic. So we want to work to foster student feedback literacy. So what I've done here and the results I've got from the data, I think that's one of many ways to help foster student feedback literacy. And I'm very interested in what the audience are doing to foster feedback literacy and what works for you, because I think many things can work. I think what's important is that we're actually attempting to foster feedback literacy and that we're having discussions with students. You know, possibly there are much better methods than the ones I've used, but the ones I've used do seem to be supported by the data that it was very helpful for the students. So we want to foster those peer learning communities, relational teaching and peer feedback. We want to use dialogic video feedback. Video feedback's great, but if there's no dialogue, students can sometimes feel a bit like it's too one-sided and that they're being spoken at and that it's not a collaborative thing. So I think it can undermine their agency a little bit. So giving them the opportunity to challenge that feedback really helps them to take an agentic perspective. Using technology that is as informal as possible. And I noticed that Joanna Tai said in the comments that we need to be careful of what technology we promote because of information, security and things like that. I agree with that. But in an ideal world, we want to make sure that the technology is as informal, as convenient, and perceived as usefully as possible. There's something called the technology acceptance model, and it predicts how students use technology, and they use it when it is as convenient and useful as possible. Minimize the number of steps that students need to use to get to their feedback or to get to their feedback dialogues. And feedback change has to be sustainable. We want students to be more active. We want to give less summative feedback. We want appropriate technologies and a balance so that more teacher effort is in the formative stages and much less is in the summative stages. Apologies if that's too much called for Newcastle, but yeah, I'd like to go over to a discussion now. So if some people have got some questions or comments that they'd like to make, then yeah.
Thanks, James. There's a couple of questions in the chat. I'll let you have a quick squeezy through those. Oh, that's really good. So have a look at those. Don't get me started on AI and feedback, etc. That's the new bastion I think we'll come to. I guess my view as you're just scrolling through those, I think peer